this is, okay, here we go. There. Well, this struggle for women's rights started from the very beginning, and this is from a letter Abigail Adams wrote to her husband that in the new code of laws, she said, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. And she went on to say that they had to do better because she said every husband would be a tyrant if he could. And she also threatened that if it was not given, that they would foment a rebellion and seize the vote, which is exactly what they did, although it took a long time. And but here's in the next slide, which is sort of interesting because in some jurisdictions, a woman could vote if she was unmarried or a widow. Married women could not vote, but in a few states like New Jersey, they failed to establish that you had to be a male gender to vote. If you were white, 21, and owned 50 pounds of property, you could vote. And this is actually a Harper's Weekly illustration, actually from much later, from about the late 19th century, because it was becoming an issue and people were more curious about it. And in the case of New Jersey, women could vote until about 1802. And one of the reasons why it was rescinded from them was that the legislature was controlled by the Jeffersonian Party, the Democratic Republicans, and the ladies had this unfortunate habit of voting for the Federalist ticket. And so they had to go. That's what had happened. But, women were always on the periphery of public life. And even though they couldn't vote, they still were a force in their home. In our town, the stage manager said it best, describing Grover's Corners. He described it as so much percent Republican. He said men voted 21, and he adds women vote indirect. And what really gave women a leg up in the 19th century was the abolition movement in the North, because they began to meet and plan strategy, attend meetings, learn rules of orders, helping to write tracts decrying the misery of slavery. And so it really basically was the solid foundation of them to liberate themselves. And I can give you an actual reason for this, because Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton attended the World Abolition Congress in London in 1840, and both of them were denied entrance to the floor because they were women. And this definitely set the stage for what came after. And here's the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls in New York State. And this is a contemporary newspaper that said that it was to discuss the social and religious and rights of women. And this is where it started. Now, of course, a lot of people then say, well, why did women need to be liberated? And basically, under the law, women didn't have very many legal rights, especially of income, because their husband made all the money for the household. They couldn't own property directly. The only thing, they did have some rights, but like, for instance, the right of dower, generally 1/3 of the dowry bought into the marriage had to be reserved to maintain the wife and their children should their husband be unable to do so, and usually because of his death. And of course, that could impact women too, because since they didn't own the property directly, it could all be sold for her late husband's debts. And in this suffragette tract, the wife said, John, where is the rest of your wages? How am I going to pay the rent and get food for the children? And her husband raises his fist. He says, shut up. What I do with my money is no business of yours. So there was a lot of issues there. Now, of course, people thought this was poppycock. I mean, even John, as I said earlier, wrote back to Abigail saying that no man would submit to petticoat government. So, as much as he loved his wife dearly, he was not on board with that. Although, being the devoted husband that he was, when she asked him for pins, he actually searched around every store in Philadelphia until he found some to send back to Boston. But in this 1857 cartoon, this is a women's Amazonian convention in New York City. You see all the men catcalling and shaking their fists and everything. So it wasn't really, an auspicious start. And these are some of the movement leaders. And, in one way, all of them, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all of them, they started newspapers, they wrote and testified before state legislatures, and they did these tireless campaigns for years and years, decades, trying to convince male-dominated political structures to recognize that women had rights that they were being denied. And the ironic thing is, none of these women lived to see it dawn, but without them, it wouldn't have happened when it did. Now, one of the main, what we would call talking points that women had at the time is that women had obligations like taxes that they were compelled to pay, but they could not vote. And this cartoon shows a drunken bum, see the bottle in his pocket, casting his ballot, whereas a woman who's got a thing of taxes and a little boy, she has a ballot too, but he's holding her off. And a policeman is right behind her to conduct her away. And it says universal suffrage limited. And that's the way it was. Now, there was quite a bit of backlash too. There was concern, which sounds eerily reminiscent of some issues today, because they said one of the things they had to worry about why women shouldn't vote is that wouldn't women vote right? And just the other day, we had a US representative saying it wasn't quantity of votes, but quality that counted. And apparently it's an issue in some way or another that's still with us, that there's some people who seem to be more favored to vote than others. And this is one of the things they had to fight about. Now, these are the reasons why men said women shouldn't vote. They were high-strung, irrational, emotional. They were not smart or educated enough, which was largely true. It was very hard for women to get an education. They should stay at home because who's going to take care of the kids? And they were too physically frail for the rigors of politics. And politics was for the strong in those days. Men shoved and cursed and pushed and screamed at each other at conventions. And on election night, there would be gangs of roving men, drunk as lords, going from polling places, voting, and it was not a pretty time. And also, this is a big fear then that they would be more masculine if they voted. They would cease to be women, and a lot of men weren't on board with that. And this cartoon is a satirical cartoon of a masculine woman who wants her rights. And the caption says, "She is mannish from shoes to her hat, coat collars, stiff shirt and cravat. She'd wear pants in the street to make her complete, but she knows the law won't stand for that." And some of this propaganda was really high powered. This thing, it says suffragists on the warpath and jump on him. He was only a mere man. And, that was so untrue. I mean, women were jostled, manhandled, thrown on the ground. by police and others. I mean, it was not easy to be a proponent of women's rights in those days. And this other thing is from a popular song. He squandered all of his case on drink and starved his wife at home. I asked, should not women get to vote? He answered with a sneer, I taught my wife to know her place. Keep woman in her sphere. And there were a lot of things, because no less a personage than President Grover Cleveland said that the gender roles had been set by the Almighty. That's what he said long ago, and it was set, and that's the way it was. Now, of course, women kept forcing the issue, and in 1873, Susan B. Anthony went on trial for trying to vote, and they fined her a considerable sum. It was $100, but she refused to pay it. She said that in her testimony that she was already $10,000 in debt for the newspaper she ran, called The Revolution, advocating women's rights. That today would be around $85,000. So, and she said it was not right that she had no jury of her peers, nor any jury at all. And she finished up by quoting Thomas Paine, who said, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. I mean, they just basically she didn't do jail time. They had to get rid of her, keep it quiet. And so basically that's what they did. Now, they did have some victories, a very early victory. The state of Wyoming is the first state in the Union to extend the franchise to women in the years after the Civil War. And women actually had better luck in the newly formed Western states and territories than they did back in the East, which tended to be more conservative. And also, in this way, women had a trump card because they were much more scarce in the West. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, 1850 was the first census in which San Francisco was included in the federal count. And there were something like 52 men to every one woman in town. And I think one way or another, these men were more inclined to let women, and it was still a very limited franchise. Basically, in these states, women could vote in like school board elections. They could do things like local elections, even up to state. In some states, they could vote. They just couldn't vote for president. Oops. Anyway, these women, they travel miles and miles. I think Susan B. Anthony logged 8,000 miles one year, going all around the country by train, unaccompanied. And both of them actually had strange paranormal experiences. So it's really sort of weird. It doesn't have much to do with women getting to vote, but it happened as a consequence. And this is what happened. Anthony was going with her niece to Cape May, New Jersey, a summer resort, which it still is in New Jersey. And she had this dream. She felt she was burning up and she was on fire. And she was so disquieted, she got up in the middle of the night and said, they must take the first train back to Philadelphia immediately, which they did. The very next day, the whole damn town burned down. Excuse me. Anyway, Stanton had an even worse experience because in her travels, she wound up in this small town at the only hotel in town, and she asked to become a room. And they told her they really didn't have anything available, but she said, any room will do. And they reluctantly gave her this tiny little room and very spare. And she said, that would be fine. And what happened was that during the night, she woke she said she felt the sensation of somebody touching her face, and she heard a voice crying, "Mother." And she was so bothered, she got up, lit a candle, and stayed up all night until she heard the servants stirring. And she told the maid when she rang for her what had happened. And the woman said that, "I told them not to put you in this room. They said the day before a young man had died in that bed calling for his mother." So it was rough on the road. And, gradually over the years, women got more organized because some of the biggest foes to women's rights were women themselves. It took a lot of meetings, a lot of one-on-one, a lot of tea parties to convince women to join the movement. And, after all, they would face considerable resistance from their husbands, their fathers, sometimes even male adult sons about participating. It wasn't considered seemly, and but they did have reasons. Like here says, working women need to vote for equal pay for equal work, and that still resonates today because on average, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a woman makes 77 cents for every dollar a man makes in the same job. And there is absolutely no reason why that should be, and yet it happens. Now, one of the things they did, they employed the new technology of a motor car and in this suffrage parade. And I thought this was really interesting because when I found this picture on the internet, that building behind the car, I said, I know this building. I really, really think I do. And so they actually had the name of a store. And I looked up the New York City directories, which are all online now. And sure enough, it was actually taken in New York City. And right behind them is sort of a rare form of irony is a street that was known then as the Ladies' Mile because of all the women's oriented clothing stores and everything. They even had a wonderful rhyme about it, very popular in the 19th century. It was called 8th Street and down, the men are earning it. 8th Street and up, the women are spurning it. 8th Street up and 8th Street down, for that's the way of this New York town. Even Congress felt compelled to take some notice of this growing movement, and they actually successfully got hearings. They actually had a committee on women's suffrage. Everyone on it, men. Actually, about 2-3 years ago, they had this famous thing on Facebook pointing out a meeting in Congress talking about women's rights and everything, and every single person at the table were male. So that was quite ironic. But as you can see, even they generated a report, they took testimony, they did all the numbers stuff, but nothing really happened. And yet this was a movement that could not be stopped. And this is one of their most successful bits of propaganda. The women began wearing white, and that indicated this is our cause is just, our cause is pure. And they also spent a lot of time smashing stereotypes, because one of the stereotypes was they were elderly, they were spinsters, they were masculine women who couldn't get a husband. And Inez Mulholland proved them all wrong. She was popular, attractive, married, and a lawyer to boot. And her most famous moment was she dressed as an Amazon on horseback at a big suffrage parade. And when some drunken men tried to disrupt the marchers, she dove into them on horseback to beat them back into the sidewalk. Now, every movement to try and do everything has significant bumps. And this is one place where the suffrage movement really dropped the ball. The challenge is that whether to allow women of color into the greater movement. And that was not popular because all of the leaders, including Stanton, Anthony, everyone, they thought that should they bring women of color into that they would lose the support of Southern white women who were considered necessary. And, if they allowed African American women to march, it was generally at the very end of the parade. So it was literally back of the bus treatment. And it says here, this suffragette is holding a sign, votes for women, and a black woman that has a sign, votes for women, and the other woman's holding her arm out, and it says for white women. And this was a real problem for them. The leaders of the movement thought, hopefully, that if they could get suffrage, universal suffrage for women, that black women would also be absorbed. That they were fighting for them. They just couldn't let them fight with them. What really helped the movement was when upper middle class and wealthy women began to take notice and become part. It actually became somewhat fashionable, and these women were being escorted off the grounds of City Hall in New York because they were wearing suffragette banners and agitating for the right to vote. And the newspaper dubbed these very well-dressed women as the Mink Brigade. And Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, she gave the movement drive, cachet, and money, and also her social connections, because once Alva did it, then everyone had to get in on to the act. And her most famous quote is to a suffragette in jail. She said, "Pray to God, she will help you." And there were changes. It took a while. And this thing, all the yellow states are equal suffrage. All the black states were male-only suffrage. And Illinois had this weird, measly complexion where in some places you couldn't vote and other places you could vote, depending on where you were actually living. And they set up headquarters all around the United States to sort of lure men in. No, let us tell you why women should vote. And they even vote shamed American men. They put things like that, naming all of these states that allowed women the right to vote. And they said, why not in New York? And Julia Ward Howe, she was the author of The Battle Hymn of the Republic. She really spent most of her life fighting for this right. And this is her in old age. And she was so well known that in a suffrage parade, they decided to have her as part of the parade. And in a memorably bad idea, they wanted to put her in a carriage and to have the carriage not pulled by horses, but by a bevy of young women in white dresses. And she was supposed to have exclaimed, "Women as beasts of burden? I wouldn't even let a man do that." Another thing that hurt the movement in 1912 was the sinking of the Titanic. And you sort of wonder, why was that? Because they were going to have a May 6, 1912 parade just weeks after the sinking. And the media at the time extolled the virtues of men who died so women could live. It wasn't until much later that they found out that more men in first class got into a lifeboat than children in third class. So much for that. But it was very controversial. A lot of people said we should cancel this. We shouldn't do this. But they held the march, and but a lot of people were still in doubt whether they should have. And also towards the end, there was a break in the ranks, and I mean, a lot of younger women got tired of the slow, cautious approach, and they wanted something more like the militant English suffrage movement. And this is Alice Paul, who actually founded her own group in order to do a more proactive way to seek the vote. And it got ugly and controversial. This is a picture of Emmeline Pankhurst being arrested. Uh, and I mean, these women, they chained themselves to fences, broke up political meetings, put graffiti all over political posters. And it was much discussed. And I found this in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle for 1908. It says suffragists compared with suffragettes. It said the latter are a militant type whose methods are opposed by Brooklyn women. So, like I said, there was always a lot of doubt. I mean, should we do it? Should we get women our rights? If we agree we should do it, how should we do it? And that's always a big problem. I think that a lot of movements after them, right up to Black Lives Matter and everybody, everyone reaches this crossroad moment about how to proceed further. And these are this is a suffragette in her prison, and they were actually arrested for being in front of the White House for disturbing the peace, and they were put in the women's reformatory in Virginia, which is not in the District of Columbia. And this young woman, she was actually chained to her cell with her arms about her head, naked all night. uh, Another was thrown by a man onto a bed without a mattress. They were denied medical treatment, and but the authorities found out that most Americans were absolutely revolted by the idea of these women in jail, and so they sort of tried to get them a free get out of jail card. Trouble was is that the women seized the initiative and said, "We're not going." They refused to leave, and they said, let the courts settle it out. And they had lawyers who argued that you can't be arrested in the District of Columbia and incarcerated outside of the district. And the Virginia judge agreed. And so that's how they got released right about Thanksgiving time. But they had been in jail for weeks and weeks, and some of them were definitely the worst aware. Some of them suffered permanent injury uh, from their treatment. So, uh, I think women definitely proved that they could stand the rigors of politics based on the way they were treated by a lot of men. They even, this is a staging of force feeding a prisoner. And this was a really nasty thing. Some of them, they would pour boiling hot soup down their throats or up their noses through a tube. I mean, it was not, I mean, this is a very sanitary arrangement to illustrate what was happening to women. And so this was a very good piece of propaganda. I like this about women really getting out there because they literally crashed Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. They staged this massive parade down Pennsylvania Avenue on March 3rd, 1913, the day before the president took the oath of office. And if you notice this place with the tower here, that is now the Trump Hotel. And here, of course, is the Capitol, right down the middle. And so there's quite a lot of recognizable places still. But there's a funny story about the president-elect stepped out of his train from New Jersey and to a virtually empty Union Station. And Union Station is big. And he asked, "Where is everyone?" And somebody told him, "Well, they're all outside watching the parade." And there were literally thousands of women. One group of women walked 234 miles from Newark, New Jersey to get here. And so the papers, everything was full of it. You could say the president-elect was most definitely upstaged that day. And You know, it just reminded me, remember a couple of years ago, during the Obama years, he's saying that he had evolved in his positions on gay marriage. Well, his counterpart 100 years earlier had also evolved. And he finally, in 1918, he said, first time in his office, he publicly endorsed the women's right to vote. And that was a major bully pit. And that was a great victory for women. And this is why he asked, one of the reasons why he evolved, because when the United States entered World War I, they needed women, and women started taking very non-traditional jobs, like they were train conductors, became plumbers. I even saw a film of a woman being a steeplejack. And this is from the YWCA, says that for every fighter, a woman worker, and these women are marching in uniform with sledgehammers and other tools. And these women on the right, they were part of the Santa Barbara Women's Motor Corps, which was set up by the American Red Cross. And during their time, they were never allowed overseas, but they were very instrumental in transporting medical supplies, medical personnel, patients from one place to another. And they actually logged over 3,000 miles during the course of the war, which was astonishing in an era when very few women knew how to drive. But some women actually did make it to the Western Front. This group these were actually these were telephone operators from the American Telephone and Telegraph, and they volunteered to keep placing calls in the rear lines so that communication could get back. And they were known all over the Western Front as the Hello Girls. And these were American nurses who went overseas, and they actually were a good advertisement. I mean, here they were facing the same dangers as the men, and healing them, placing telephone calls for them. And of course, they were dealing with a bunch of young men, basically 18 to 23 or 24. So they were dealing with a much more receptive audience than in the United States. And it began to tell, because eventually Tennessee became the 36th state in the Union to ratify the 19th Amendment. And once that was done, I mean, it became the law of the land. But it took a long time. Just think, starting in 1848, and this is now 1920. So this was a long, long road. And some people were not entirely on board. This is from a newspaper in Florida history. Florida ratifies 19th Amendment in 1969, granting women the right to vote. Now, no woman was prevented from voting in 1920. Absolutely not. I mean, because the way our system is set up, once the federal government says it's legal, everyone else has to do the same, whether they want to or not. And so they just decided to clean it up and finally ratify it. But actually, I think the big issue in Florida was whether women had to pay the poll tax for 1919 and 1920, or whether they should just pay it for 1920. And of course, we all know what poll taxes were for. They were supposed to keep African Americans from voting because few of them could afford to pay that. It's remembered in the media in various different ways. This is Loretta Young and the Lady from Cheyenne in 1941, who argues persuasively, as far as the picture says, to allow women's right to vote in Wyoming. But the 2004 movie Iron Jawed Angels is far more accurate. And there's all these monuments and displays. This is in Seneca Falls, New York, showing the leaders of the movement. And this character, She is dressed as a bloomer girl, which never quite took off, but the idea was to have these pantaloons and a short dress, sort of mid-calf, to give women more freedom of movement. Because that was another consideration in them trying to get the right to vote. It was very hard walking around wearing tight corsets, bustles, lots of clothing. I mean, our custom of a man leading a woman around the dance floor is just a custom, but back then it was literally a physical necessity. And of course, there's a lot of documentaries, and we have a couple in our Canopy website. So if you're all you have to do is have a library card, and you could go in and see what they have available. And we also have a lot of early cinema, a lot of documentaries. So I think it's definitely well worth checking out. There were also organizations that were set up to keep women's legacy. And the first one is the League of Women's Voters, which sort of became a more general type organization, because now if you ever have to vote on some ballot issues here in Florida or any state, you go onto their website and they explain in regular everyday language, what the ballot is meant to say, because the ballots themselves can be very highly confusing, and they're written that way purposely, and to sort of obscure what they're trying to do. And so the league sort of helps sort it out. They tell you what it will do. They will tell you whether they believe you should or should not vote for it. And they're a very powerful organization. And this on the right is actually by the US Department of Labor, and it's still called the Women's Bureau. And it's a good way to find out current issues involving working women. And that's the end. Like I said, if you couldn't stay, you all know how it ended. Women won the right to vote. It was a long way road to do it, but they achieved it to make a more just United States. So thank you for listening and tuning in.
Hi, thanks everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now so we can have a Q&A. Thank you for joining.